My name is Jonathan Potskin. I am Cree and Métis from Alberta, Treaty 8. Cree from Sarge First Nation, I'm a member there, and I'm also Métis from my dad's side. I also grew up in the Friendship Center movement. I was born in the Friendship Center movement. My parents played for the Native Sons and Daughters in Edmonton. They used to have ball tournaments, and so that's how I was created, from one weekend at a ball tournament. So if you want to know a Friendship Center person, I'm it, But my grandmother worked for the Friendship Center in Edmonton for 32 years. Her name was Georgina Donald. And so when you have a grandparent who works in the Friendship Center movement, your whole family is Friendship Center movement, So I grew up doing everything at the Friendship Center in Edmonton my whole life until I was an adult and moved away from Edmonton. But now I work for the National Association of Friendship Centers. I actually worked for NUICC in 2019 and 2020, and I helped plan the gathering in 2020. It was right before the lockdown. But NUICC also gave me the opportunity to work at NUICC. I was living in Australia. I did my PhD in Australia. And when I moved back, I was still completing my PhD. And while I was working for NUICC, I was able to finish my PhD. So this is a special place for me as well, because my PhD was on urban Indigenous youth. So I looked at Indigenous rap music and how Indigenous youth are passing on traditional knowledge through rap music. So I'm really about the urban movement when it comes to urban Indigenous people, especially urban Indigenous youth, because I was a part of that movement. I was part of the UNDRIP movement, and so I was part of we used to have youth funding, and we used to collaborate as youth and give out the funding to Edmonton, local Edmonton organizations. But I'll go into, wrong notes. I had a PowerPoint, but I decided not to use it because I don't know how much time it will take me to get through that. But I did bring I don't know if you guys have it. I emailed a visual, but I'll just go on, and the visual makes sense after sorry, I'm starting to get, my nose is starting to get runny. So I'm the manager of research and policy at the National Association of Friendship Centers. We just started working on our research and policy team in the last 5 years, redeveloping it and looking at the new way of doing research and policy at the Friendship Center level. So far, we've been a part of the UAKN, which is the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network. And this is where the Friendship Center really developed a lot of its skills. It's in partnership with Trent University. Oh, perfect, thank you. I don't know why I got up here and all of a sudden my nose got runny. Yeah. Thank you. But in policy and research, we have different areas of research. But right now, I'm actually working on creating a national urban Indigenous research framework for the Friendship Centers. It's called what do I call it? The Urban Indigenous Knowledge Nest. So what we're looking at is creating a research center that is housed nationally at the National Association of Friendship Centers, but where we could have hubs of research knowledge centers or else urban research nests across the country through our friendship centers and through their partners. So friendship centers are not working alone in the cities that they're working in. They're working in collaboration, which shows with the coalitions here. I think almost every coalition has a friendship center involved with it. So I think that's one of the great things about being a part of the national coalitions is there is also a Friendship Center voice in here. And I know from my experience of growing up in Edmonton, most of the Indigenous organizations that are in Edmonton, they were created at the Friendship Center level and then moved out. So that's from my experience anyways. But yeah, in research right now, we're looking at housing and homelessness. And right now we just brought out in partnership with the OFHA, the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. They brought out a report on encampments last week. We're not directly quoted in there, but we're actually bringing on a national Indigenous encampments research report in a month from now, and that's in collaboration with the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. And so with that, we really consider that working under UNDRIP, because we're really looking at how Indigenous people, for myself, who comes from Treaty 8, in our treaty, we're allowed to travel across Canada, and our rights are not supposed to be taken away from us no matter where we are in this country. Whether we're living in the city or on our reserve, our rights it shouldn't matter where we live. Our rights should always be recognized. And that's under UNDRIP as well. So UNDRIP really supports the urban Indigenous movement, especially with the research movement. I'll get into this soon, sorry, I'll just let you explore that. We have a language project. So this year, we're gonna start looking at Indigenous languages and how Friendship Centers teach Indigenous languages and how we can support the language instructors. So looking at knowledge mobilization through the instructors instead of just the program itself. And so how do we develop language learning at the Friendship Center level? So we're looking at language within the Friendship Center research, housing and homelessness, which I said, but we also have a housing action plan that's going to be coming out next year. So we're working on that right now as well through research. And then we also have a data collection area. We have a data department, and they collect all the data that comes from our programs and services. So with the research and the data, what we can do is collect evidence-based data through the Friendship Center level. And so we're able to use our Friendship Centers to recognize and give numbers to different services and programs that Friendship Centers deliver. And we're able to put them into policy. So next, we have our policy team. So when I talk about the circle, we'll have like research, data, and then policy should be our knowledge mobilization where they're sending the information out. We have over 120 Friendship Centers across the country that belong to us. And our governance style is we have a national board of directors that is representative of all our Friendship Centers across the country. And then they vote our board in, and our board actually developed our strategic plan. And this is what came out of our 10-year strategic plan. Our board is actually revisiting it. It's 5 years now. So they're revisiting the strategic plan. But through the board's work in 2019 and 2020, they developed this guiding principles and values. So through this guiding principles and values, actually, this is our governance. This is the governance of the National Association of Friendship Centers. And if you look at the flowers, those are all the guiding principles and values. But the leaves on the ends are our impacts. So we want to measure all of that through the 4 impacts. And so through research, I'm creating the research framework through the governance values that came through our governance system. So this is how you use governance to research and how you could create a framework. I did a lot of this with not Friendship Centers, with some First Nations. All I did was developed it through the mission and vision statement is like the ontology, the worldview of Indigenous people. So this is the Friendship Center's worldview. This is where our mission and vision statement, and then our movement is based off of these values. So these values are what moves us forward in our research, or just in our programs and services that we provide at NAFC. And then through that, we do the methodological work, and then we go into the impacts. So you'll see a lot of the work that we're coming out in the next few years will really be put through the impacts. So that's where the measuring tool for us is through our impacts and what impacts we're making in the community. In policy right now, we're co-developing a lot of different projects. We're with Justice Canada, we just put in our recommendations for the Indigenous Justice Act. But we also just finished, we just received funding to start a UNDRIP and UNDA toolkit for urban Indigenous people through the Friendship Centers. We also got funding to do, we just completed our Youth Council's GBA Plus analysis. So this is really good. The GBA Plus analysis that our Youth Council created uses these values, and I'll go into a little bit more of the values after. Our Murder, Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit Peoples project, they just finished their strategic planning, and we'll have an action plan by next April on how the Friendship Centers are going to move forward within that movement to the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. With our health file right now, we're actually looking at end-of-life care. So we're actually doing engagements with Friendship Centers. Oh, starting again. We're actually doing engagements with Friendship Centers right now on how they work with end-of-life care. This is a part of the MAID, Medical Assisted Dying project, program that's happening with the federal government. So we found that we were being ignored when it came to that, and especially our Friendship Centers. Our Friendship Centers do a lot of end-of-life care with our community, and the aftercare that comes with that as well. So we really got ourselves involved into the MAID project, into the MAID policy work, and then also working with end-of-life care. So we're working at Friendship Centers right now through the engagements of seeing what we do and what kind of support systems are needed for our Friendship Centers when it comes to end-of-life care, because it's one of those unpaid working things that we do in our communities that is not recognized. We also are part of the Indigenous Health Legislation Act. We're part of the intersectionality group. So when it comes to that, they really follow the I can't even remember what it's called, distinctions-based approach when it comes to health. So we sit there and we represent urban Indigenous people ourselves, and then there's a few other groups that sit on that table. But through that table, we're able to, we're called intersectional. So I think that's where we need, I found it just kind of ignorant, that's taking us out of an Indigenous identity and just putting us into this intersectional, like, oh, they're just a bunch of intersectional people that live in the city. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be held with the Indigenous health legislation. They're still working on that, and I think that's something that we need to do as urban Indigenous peoples, really put our voices forward for that health legislation. So any way that you can get involved with that, I would try to get involved, whether it's writing letters to the minister or whatever, but the health legislation isn't following through with the urban Indigenous recommendations. And they do conflict a lot with the distinctions-based approach. So I think that's where the government really is in a weird spot right now, because they want to recognize us as urban Indigenous people, but the distinctions-based approach is also there that interrupts it, because we also have those identities as well as urban and Indigenous people. So I think there's this different lens that they need to take, and I don't know what that lens is. Through environment and climate change, we're actually looking through, so the way things happen with a lot of the work that we do is it comes through resolutions at our AGMs. So it's our membership that guides the work that we do. So if there's any work that you want us to do in your Friendship Center, you just go to the AGM and you put your resolution forward. So this year we had a resolution on to look into climate change and emergency response that the governments do. And so right now we're doing engagements on that, and we're looking forward to bringing out an action plan on how Friendship Centers can be more recognized with the work they're doing on climate change and emergency response. Sorry, I'm trying to get through this as fast as I can because I knew this was going to be like an hour presentation for me. Our youth and child file, there's a lot in the youth and child file right now. It's really being led through Jordan's Principles work. So we're looking at ways to advocate for urban Indigenous people through the Jordan Principles work. And actually in the health field too, we're actually we're bringing forward Joyce's principle whenever we bring forward anything in health. Joyce's principle from Joyce in Quebec. Yeah, has she gone? Yeah, has she gone? Through that situation, there was a principle like Jordan's principle that was brought forward. So that's how we bring forward the community voice in the work that we do, is we take these principles that come from the community, we make sure we advocate for them at the level that we're at the national level, and we sit on a lot of different tables with government and other organizations. But a lot of the work that we're doing is based off of, it's not there no more, based off the ontological work and vision and mission statement and the guiding principles. We also follow 3 other principles within policy and research and what we look for. And cultural understanding is one of the first things that we look for when we're assessing the work that we're doing. Intersectionality, I know I just said I don't like being called intersectional, but doesn't mean that we don't work within an intersectional lens. For people that don't understand intersectionality, it's the different identities that come within being Indigenous. So like myself, I have 2 Métis and Cree, which is an intersectional approach of being Indigenous. So which rights do I belong to? Where do I belong? I go to the Métis Nation and they're trying to kick me out of the meetings all the time. I go to my band office and they're trying to kick me out of the meetings. So I don't know where I belong, but the Friendship Center was the place where I did belong. So I have to say the Friendship Center is a community group, a representative of who we are. But we look at those intersectionality, especially coming from I worked for Two Spirits in Motion for a year and a half as well, which is the Two Spirit National Organization. And it's an intersectionally based approach that they take. So I was able to bring that forward here. If it's already here, I'm just able to use that knowledge that I had there. Intersectionality comes from the feminist movement, if anybody doesn't know. And so it's based off of that movement. And now we're looking at Indigenous intersectionality and the different forms of intersections that we have as Indigenous people. And so through the intersectionality, I look at these 4 impacts. And intersectionality, when we bring out these impacts, you'll see that these impacts will be stronger to influence succession, sustainability, and relevance. So intersectionality will allow the voice of many to come forward through our research. So when I looked at the nest, I'm creating this right now, so I don't have the physical stuff right. But the physical nest is, when I was living here during lockdown, and I was able to watch 2 ravens make their nest out in front of my window while we're sitting in our homes all for like 2 months. And that's where I really got this knowledge base, is I was watching these birds build their nest, and they were using straws or whatever they're finding in the urban community, right? They're finding whatever. And I thought that's who we are as urban Indigenous people. This is still our environment. This is our community. This is who we are. This is our ontology. This is, it's our worldview. We have a different worldview than First Nations that grew up in the reserve. The ones that grew up in the city are going to have different worldviews. And we need to recognize that. So that intersectional approach allows us to have different worldviews. It allows us to be acknowledged for who we are. It doesn't matter where we come from. because we all come from different Indigenous identities, different education backgrounds, different cities, towns. So that intersectionality allows us to not take a rigid and strict view of what Indigenous research looks like, but to take an Indigenous approach to research. And then we just focus on Indigenous knowledges, which is everything that is coming from us. Yeah, I think that's about it. Just about, oh, I forgot one more research project that I really like. It's research and policy. Juanique Horn-Miller, who is an Olympian, is working with us on a community-driven project on sports and rec. So in the next year and a half, we should probably be looking at a strategy in, with friendship centers in sports and recreation. Yeah, so I'll leave it there for now, but I just wanted to show how a governance structure can really guide research and policy development within an organization.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So I have a comment and a question, actually. So I remember when we used to work together back in, was it 2020? Yeah, 2019, 2020. And I remember you saying the work that you were doing at the time of engagement with youth. Youth, back in my day, we used to be invited to colonial meetings and thought that we were so special to be invited to go and sit at City Hall. Well, young people don't engage that way anymore, yeah. Really, and nor should they. But I remember you saying that it was through resistance and decolonization. Yeah. And I didn't even know what that was when I was young. So I'm glad to see that that's evolving and that's changing. So that's one thing that I learned from you at the time I was grateful for. I also have a question about in the research world, I'm wondering if, because Indigenous people have been researching, and I know that you're looking at research from Indigenous perspectives, but I'm wondering if there is thought out there around trauma-informed research policy that exists in the research world, or if there's any talk about that sort of thing.
Well, I think that comes from like the OCAP principles, even though it's very basic, OCAP, you know, if you just look at that, but it's supposed to be coming from an Indigenous informed approach, and Indigenous trauma informed approach is everything that we take. And I think in our research, especially that we've been doing in the last 6 months, it's flexibility is the big thing when it comes to that in research. Trauma, because there's a lot of times we're in the middle of an interview and you could have somebody who gets traumatized by a topic, just say Indigenous hip hop, when I was doing that. There's a lot of different stories that come from there. And it's just about being able to take that time to stop the research and to let them be who, and so there's a lot of times where I've done research where I planned on doing 10 interviews and I only got 3 in the end. But that was because a lot of people commit and then a lot of people get anxious. There's a lot of anxiety in our community, especially from sharing your own personal story. So when I do research, I don't look at numbers, I look at the quality of it. So I think this says it all here. Stories have always been our governance, and that's what research is. It's taking other people's stories. So when I did my PhD, I called myself a storyteller, not a researcher, and I was collecting other people's stories, and so from a cultural standpoint, I was holding their stories, so I became their storyteller, and I had an ethical responsibility to all those stories that I took from everybody else to make sure I was telling them properly and informed everybody that what the approach was. So like one thing that I do in my research, and we're trying to the approach here we're doing here is not to do transcriptions. So you only listen to the voice of the person. So if you can't remember what was said, you go back to the recording and try to find what was said again. Because when you have things in transcriptions, you're able to take that spirit out of it and just see it on paper and get what you want. And so another thing is I'm teaching our researchers and our policy analysts that it's all right to fail. It's all right if we don't make it to the end with the answer that we wanted. I find that when it comes to research in a non-Indigenous perspective, you'll never find that any researcher is wrong. And I want us to be wrong. I want us to be wrong because in being wrong is like, I learned the most of my lessons in my life have been learned for being wrong, not for being right, you know? So I think there's a process within research, within Indigenous research, where we want more accountability with each other. Now that's not just at the French third level, I know it from a lot of other Indigenous researchers, is we want accountability with our communities and ourselves, and not to always have research that that is successful. We can have research that's unsuccessful, but as long as we learn from it. And I think that's the process from an Indigenous trauma-informed care approach that we want to take, is we're not trying to force a research agenda and bring out a voice that we projected it to be before the research. We want to actually take the research and let it be organic.
Yeah, thank you for that. The purpose of research is to learn, right? So calling the learnings a failure, we reframe the way we still learned, it's successful. Thank you. Are there any questions for Jonathan?
Well, thank you. And I'm really happy to talk to anybody after on my PhD or at NAFC.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jonathan.